This is the final lesson in this Photography for Dummies class, and if you've made it this far, then I really applaud you for your commitment and effort. In this concluding video, we will take a look at different ways in which you can tinker with your ISO, shutter speed, and aperture to achieve certain artistic effects in your images. Let's begin with ISO. In a lot of preceding lessons, we've spoken about how you ideally want to maintain as low an ISO as possible at all times to avoid digital noise in your image. However, I'm sure a lot of you have seen those vintage-looking photos that are usually black and white or sepia that have a very characteristic grain that is pleasing to the eye. And while the effects can be achieved in post-production, the grain can also be achieved by simply just raising your ISO. Now, of course, your mileage will vary because this will all depend on how well your camera performs in low light, but my advice is play around with your ISO settings and determine what the limitations of your camera are before attempting this. Now, as mentioned before in previous lessons, aperture is the most important tool for controlling exposure, and this is primarily due to the fact that it does not negatively affect image quality in any way. Aperture is also important because it is one of the most important factors to consider when picking out a lens system. We know that a wider aperture will give you a narrower depth of field, and a small aperture will result in a deep depth of field. But where exactly would you want to make use of that? Here are just a few situations. If you want to take professional looking portrait photos where the foreground and background are a creamy blur of bokeh, then you need to make use of a wide aperture. I suggest nothing smaller than f2. To get the best defocusing effects, you also want to move as close as possible to your subject whilst maintaining framing and use a background that is as far behind as possible from the subject. A smaller aperture can be useful for photographing vast landscapes where you want a large portion of the foreground and background in focus. But another scenario where a small aperture is useful is with slow shutter photography. We said that a slower shutter causes motion blurring in your image, and it also increases your exposure, sometimes too excessively. So, to cut down on the light in order to correctly expose, you can close your aperture, which can help you achieve the desired effect. Like a waterfall where the water is a dreamy white cloud, or the cosmos where the stars are eye-catching light streaks, or even in the city where moving objects become interesting smudges of color. In the last few examples, it's easy to see that shutter speed and aperture come together to produce some truly creative and beautiful artistic effects. In terms of shutter speed, a fast shutter can be used to freeze motion like a cheetah running at full speed, or a basketball player as they jump for the shot, or even a chameleon as it catches its prey. As mentioned earlier, a slow shutter can be used to emphasize the motion of moving objects with motion blur alongside the help of aperture to keep the exposure in check. But another place where a slow shutter can be used to achieve stunning results is in low light stationary environments where there really isn't enough light to expose correctly with ISO and aperture. These images generally come out looking really nice with a characteristic wallpaper-like looking effect. In most cases, you also get a very subtle grain in the image as a result of the sensor being exposed for such a lengthy period of time. Don't be afraid to experiment with your camera and play around with different settings to see what the results will be. The best way to learn is through trial and error. A wise man once said that for the things we have to learn before we can do them, we learn by doing them. Thank you very much for tuning into this digital photography fundamentals class. I hope that your time here has been well spent and educationally fruitful. You should all now be able to pick up your cameras, put them in manual mode, and take amazing photographs. For those of you that haven't already done so, make sure to check out the quizzes I've prepared in the project section of this class. The quizzes are designed to test your learning and understanding. I promise they really aren't too difficult. Once again, thank you guys for joining me, and I look forward to hearing from you in future classes where we'll go further in depth into digital photography. Happy learning, everyone.